The scent of linseed oil and aged canvas was my perfume, the hum of the air filtration system my constant lullaby. Here, in the hushed, sterile environment of the National Gallery's conservation studio, I, Maria Morales, found my truest self. For years, I'd been a quiet fixture, a restorer whose meticulous hands could coax life back into fading masterpieces, yet whose own ambition often remained cloaked in the shadows of more prominent colleagues. My name, when spoken, was usually followed by a reference to someone else, a project I'd assisted on, never one I'd led. This particular Tuesday, the anonymity felt heavier than usual. My current assignment was Dusk Over the Thames by Isabella Crowe, an artist whose name barely warranted a footnote in the sprawling volumes of art history. The painting itself was small, unremarkable, depicting a rather mundane London skyline at twilight, thick with the grime of a century. The acquisition board had seen it as a minor historical curiosity, a fill-in piece for a rotating display of forgotten Victoriana. For me, it was just another canvas awaiting resurrection, or so I thought. I began my work methodically, a symphony of delicate strokes and precise chemical applications. The gentle swish of cotton swabs saturated with solvent, the slow, satisfying reveal of original color beneath layers of darkened varnish and grime. It was a meditation, a dance between my hand and Isabella's long dormant brushstrokes. But as the familiar London fog began to lift from the painted Thames, I felt a prickle of unease. The density of the paint, particularly in the darker areas of the sky, was unusual. It wasn't the typical thin, almost ethereal application of a minor landscape artist. It felt deliberate, layered, like a secret. Dr. Alastair Finch, my distinguished mentor, a man whose silver hair and tweed jackets were as much a part of the museum's fabric as the marble statues, often stopped by my studio. He was known for his sharp intellect and even sharper wit, and for his uncanny ability to spot talent, and, some whispered, to cultivate it for his own benefit. He paused beside me, his gaze sweeping over the painting. "Still wrestling with Miss Crowe, Maria?" He chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "A rather pedestrian piece, I admit, but a useful exercise in patience. Though I do admire your imaginative approach to its interpretation." He patted my shoulder, a gesture I'd always taken as paternal encouragement, and moved on. His words, imaginative approach, echoed in my mind. He seemed like my only ally in a museum that valued established names over emerging theories. Yet there was always a subtle edge to his compliments, a faint undertone I couldn't quite place. That evening, long after the last security guard had made their rounds, and the only sounds were the distant rumble of the tube and the whisper of my own breathing, I found myself still at Isabella's canvas. The unease persisted. I flipped the painting over, something I rarely did mid-restoration unless I suspected structural issues. The back of the canvas was rough, stained, and unremarkable. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the low light of my task lamp, I saw it. Faint, almost imperceptible, etched into the fabric itself was a series of tiny, almost invisible brushstrokes. They formed a pattern, not random smudges, but a deliberate sequence, like a forgotten language, a cipher. My heart gave a little jolt. This wasn't just grime, this was a whisper from the past. Convinced now that my intuition was right, that Isabella Crowe had more to say than a simple landscape could convey, I decided to push the boundaries of my routine. I logged into the lab's X-ray fluorescence scanner, a magnificent piece of technology usually reserved for authenticating old masters. It was after hours, strictly against protocol for a routine piece, but the cipher on the back of the canvas burned in my mind. I carefully positioned Dusk Over the Thames on the scanner bed, adjusted the parameters, and initiated the scan. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in a soft, ethereal glow. What emerged stole my breath. It wasn't just layers of paint or a reused canvas, as was common for impoverished artists. Beneath the familiar London skyline, a complete underpainting materialized, vibrant and intricate. It wasn't another scene, no preliminary sketch of a forgotten street corner. It was a meticulously drawn celestial map. Stars, nebula, constellations, a breathtaking cosmic panorama. But as I zoomed in, a chill ran through me, a thrilling mixture of awe and bewilderment. The constellations, while recognizable, were deliberately, profoundly misaligned. The heavens depicted were not the 1880s London sky, nor any sky I recognized from astronomical charts. It was a code. The excitement that coursed through me was a physical shock, a jolt of pure adrenaline. This wasn't just a painting, it was a treasure map, a puzzle woven into linen and pigment. Isabella Crowe hadn't merely painted a landscape, she had hidden an entire universe within it. And in that moment, I felt an undeniable, fierce connection to the woman who had created it. A woman who, like me, had clearly harbored secrets and dreams far grander than the world had ever acknowledged. The real work, I realized, had only just begun. The celestial map, glowing with an otherworldly luminescence on the scanner screen, was more than just an image, it was a revelation. It pulsed with Isabella's intent, a silent challenge whispered across a century. I spent the rest of the night, and indeed much of the following weekend, poring over it, comparing it to historical star charts, astronomical records, anything I could find. The misalignments were consistent, deliberate. This wasn't a mistake, it was a cipher, and I felt a surge of professional pride mixed with a fierce, almost protective loyalty to Isabella Crowe. She deserved to be heard. My excitement was palpable when I walked into the acquisitions board meeting the following Monday. The oak-paneled room, usually a tomb of hushed reverence, felt charged with my anticipation. I laid out my evidence, the original painting, the X-ray fluorescent scans, detailed overlays highlighting the hidden map, and my preliminary analysis of the celestial discrepancies. "Gentlemen and Miss Albright," I began, my voice steadier than my trembling hands, "this is not merely dusk over the Thames. Beneath the visible landscape lies an intricately rendered celestial map, and it is, unequivocally, a code." I explained the deliberate misalignments, the unusual density of the paint, the faint cipher on the canvas's reverse. I watched their faces, searching for understanding, for even a flicker of the wonder I felt. Instead, I saw polite skepticism, then outright dismissal. Mr. Davies, a senior curator whose specialty was Dutch masters, cleared his throat. "Ms. Morales, while your technical skill is, as always, beyond reproach, the notion of a hidden, coded map within a minor Victorian landscape hits quite a leap. As you know, it was common practice for less affluent artists to reuse canvases. What you've identified is most likely an abandoned underpainting, perhaps a failed astronomical study, simply painted over." His words hit me like a physical blow. A failed astronomical study? It was so reductive, so dismissive of Isabella's genius. I tried to argue, to point out the meticulous detail, the deliberate nature of the misalignments, but the board members exchanged weary glances. Then, Dr. Alistair Finch stepped in. He stood beside me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Maria has indeed performed a remarkable feat of technical analysis," he announced to the room, his voice resonating with authority. "Her X-ray work is impeccable, revealing layers we might otherwise never have known existed." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the board, then settling on me with what appeared to be warm approval. "However," he continued, a subtle shift in his tone, Her interpretation, while passionate and undeniably imaginative, remains, at this stage, a theory, an unproven theory. We must be cautious not to allow enthusiasm to overshadow rigorous academic process. His words, meant to be supportive, felt like a public undermining. He'd praised my technical skills, only to gently, subtly frame my entire conclusion as a flight of fancy. The board members nodded, clearly relieved to have their own skepticism validated by the esteemed Dr. Finch. After the meeting, the museum director, a kind but pragmatic woman named Eleanor Vance, pulled me aside. "Maria, your dedication is admirable, truly," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But we must focus our resources on verifiable discoveries. Chasing fantasies, however compelling, can lead us astray. Perhaps it's best to complete the restoration as planned, and then we can revisit this theory should new evidence emerge." I walked away feeling utterly foolish, isolated, and yet, paradoxically, more determined than ever. They saw a reused canvas, an abandoned sketch. I saw a deliberate secret, a brilliant mind trying to communicate across time. The star chart was too precise, too deliberately wrong to be an accident. My resolve, momentarily shaken, hardened into defiance. I would prove them wrong. I would prove Isabella right. But the star chart, for all its meticulous detail, remained stubbornly indecipherable. I spent weeks in the museum archives, poring over Victorian astronomical texts, occult societies, cartographic anomalies, anything that might shed light on Isabella's unique celestial arrangement. Nothing fit. The constellations were there, but their positions made no astronomical sense for any known period or location. I felt a growing frustration, a dull ache of intellectual defeat. One afternoon, Alistair found me hunched over a stack of dusty volumes. "Still chasing ghosts, Maria?" he asked, a sympathetic note in his voice. "Perhaps you're looking in the wrong place. The Victorians had a peculiar fascination with esoteric astronomy, you know. There was a rather obscure group, the London Astrolabe Society, I believe, that dabbled in unconventional star mapping. Mostly dilettantes, but worth a look, perhaps. I recall seeing some of their pamphlets in the old university library's special collections." It was a slim lead, but I was desperate. I thanked him profusely and spent the next week immersed in the archives of the London Astrolabe Society. It was, as Alistair had suggested, a dead end. Their star maps were whimsical, astrological charts, completely unrelated to the precise, if misaligned, constellations Isabella had painted. The week was a frustrating blur of dusty pages and mounting disappointment. Alistair's suggestion had led me nowhere. Returning to the museum late one evening, exhausted and disheartened, I decided I needed a break, a change of scenery. I remembered Alistair mentioning a particular art history book, a rare edition on 19th century female artists that might offer a fresh perspective on Isabella's contemporaries. He'd said it was in his office and he wouldn't mind if I borrowed it. His office door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the silent corridor. He wasn't there. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open, intending to quickly grab the book. My eyes scanned his immaculately organized desk, and then I saw it. Tucked beneath a stack of current periodicals, partially obscured, was a pile of research notes. My breath caught in my throat. The top page had a familiar name scrawled across it: Isabella Crowe. My stomach dropped, a cold, sickening sensation. Curiosity, mixed with a sudden, dreadful premonition, compelled me forward. I couldn't resist a glance. The notes were extensive, meticulously detailed, filled with cross-references and annotations. They weren't recent, some pages were dated years ago. He had known. He had been researching Isabella Crowe for years. He had already deciphered half the code, had recognized the deliberate misalignments, the celestial map's true nature. He was using my fresh perspective, my technical skills, to solve the final piece of a puzzle he had already largely unraveled. His misdirection, his sympathetic suggestions, his public undermining, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The secret was out. My trusted mentor, the man who had always seemed like my only ally, was a fraud. And his betrayal, a calculated, cold-hearted deception, was the key I hadn't known I was looking for. The cold dread in my stomach turned into a searing anger, hotter and more potent than any frustration I'd felt before. Alistair's notes, meticulously organized, dated back years. He hadn't just stumbled upon Isabella Crowe, he'd been systematically hunting her, piecing together her life, her art, her secrets. He wasn't my ally, he was my adversary, using me as a tool to finish his own long-standing quest. The London Astrolabe Society wasn't a sympathetic suggestion, it was a deliberate misdirection, a poisoned breadcrumb meant to waste my time while he consolidated his own findings. The secret was out. My trusted mentor, the man who had always seemed like my only ally, was a fraud. And his betrayal, a calculated, cold-hearted deception, was the key I hadn't known I was looking for. The cold dread in my stomach turned into a searing anger, hotter and more potent than any frustration I'd felt before. Alistair's notes, meticulously organized, dated back years. He hadn't just stumbled upon Isabella Crowe, he'd been systematically hunting her, piecing together her life, her art, her secrets. He wasn't my ally, he was my adversary, using me as a tool to finish his own long-standing quest. The London Astrolabe Society wasn't a sympathetic suggestion, it was a deliberate misdirection, a poisoned breadcrumb meant to waste my time while he consolidated his own findings. But as the initial sting of betrayal began to dull, a sharper, colder clarity cut through. His misdirection wasn't just a distraction, it was the final twisted clue. The London Astrolabe Society. Why London? Why would a group focused on esoteric celestial mapping specifically highlight its London connection? And why had Alistair, knowing the map was a code, pointed me to a group that dealt in unconventional star mapping but was demonstrably focused on a specific locale? Suddenly, the star chart on my X-ray scans shimmered with a new meaning. It wasn't about the stars at all. It was about London. Isabella Crowe hadn't misaligned the constellations for astronomical reasons. She had used the familiar shapes of the heavens as a highly sophisticated, deeply personal overlay for a map of her own city. The stars weren't constellations, they were landmarks, significant points in her life mapped onto a celestial grid as a double blind. The London Astrolabe Society, with its local focus, was Alistair's subtle attempt to nudge me towards a terrestrial interpretation, even as he sent me on a wild goose chase. He hadn't just known, he had known how it worked, and he had been trying to guide me, perhaps even test me, while securing his own claim. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of revelation and urgency. I didn't confront Alistair. There was no time for emotional confrontations. He was ahead of me, but now I had the key. I had to move faster, think smarter. He had used my technical skills. Now I would use his research against him. I raced back to the lab, pulling out every historical map of London I could find, particularly those from the late 19th century. I overlaid the X-ray scan of Isabella's celestial map onto a detailed street map of Victorian London. The misaligned constellations, once so baffling, now began to resolve into a network of recognizable locations. The bright star that had represented Polaris on Isabella's map, for instance, aligned perfectly with the Royal Academy of Arts, a place where Isabella Crowe, a female artist in a male-dominated world, would have both yearned to exhibit and perhaps faced rejection. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of revelation and urgency. I didn't confront Alistair. There was no time for emotional confrontations. He was ahead of me, but now I had the key. I had to move faster, think smarter. He had used my technical skills. Now I would use his research against him. I raced back to the lab, pulling out every historical map of London I could find, particularly those from the late 19th century. I overlaid the X-ray scan of Isabella's celestial map onto a detailed street map of Victorian London. The misaligned constellations, once so baffling, now began to resolve into a network of recognizable locations. The bright star that had represented Polaris on Isabella's map, for instance, aligned perfectly with the Royal Academy of Arts, a place where Isabella Crowe, a female artist in a male-dominated world, would have both yearned to exhibit and perhaps faced rejection. Another cluster of stars pointed to the area of Chain Walk in Chelsea, known for its artistic community during that period, and where Isabella was known to have briefly rented a studio. Each star wasn't just a point, it was a node in a narrative, a breadcrumb trail through Isabella's life and struggles. I cross-referenced these locations with the sparse biographical details I had found on Isabella Crowe, and even with some of Alistair's notes I'd glimpsed. He had done the legwork of identifying key places in her life. I just needed to map them correctly. The pressure was immense. Alistair knew I had seen his notes. He knew I knew. He would be working feverishly, trying to beat me to the finish line. The map wasn't just a collection of points. There was a sequence, implied by the subtle variations in paint density that I'd noticed during my initial cleaning, or perhaps by the faint lines on the reverse of the canvas, the cipher I'd dismissed earlier as mere pattern. I realized now that the cipher on the back was not just a pattern, but a series of directional indicators connecting these stars in a specific order. Hours blurred into a frantic montage of historical maps, biographical snippets, and my glowing X-ray scans. Coffee became my lifeline. My eyes burned, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. The trail led me from the Royal Academy to her brief studio in Chelsea, then to a specific print shop near Fleet Street, where she'd apparently sold some early anonymous etchings, and finally to the home of a known patron, a suffragette who had championed women in the arts. Each location was a step in her journey, a testament to her quiet defiance. And then the final cluster of stars. They didn't point outwards into the city, but inwards. They converged, not on a specific street address, but on a shape, an outline that became chillingly familiar. It was the footprint of the museum itself. More precisely, it pointed to the original Victorian wing, a section of the building that had undergone numerous renovations over the decades. But where within the museum? The star chart, in its ingenious complexity, offered one last layer. The central star that represented the destination was subtly different from the others. It wasn't just a point, it had a slight, almost imperceptible elongation, a brushstroke that on the celestial map looked like a comet's tail, but on the terrestrial map, when magnified, revealed a faint, rectangular indentation. I looked at a set of old architectural blueprints for the museum, dated from its original construction in the 1880s. I searched for the specific section of the Victorian wing, and there it was. A small, unlabeled rectangular space tucked away between two larger exhibition halls, marked simply as an architectural void, a walled-off alcove, a forgotten space. Isabella hadn't just hidden her masterpiece, she had hidden it within the very institution that had, perhaps, overlooked her in life. The final clue wasn't just a location, it was a physical space, an empty chamber waiting to reveal its century-old secret. My hands trembled, not from fear or anger anymore, but from the sheer exhilaration of discovery. I knew, with absolute certainty, what lay behind that wall, and I knew I had to get there before Alistair did. The race was on, and the finish line was just a wall away. My hands trembled, not from fear or anger anymore, but from the sheer exhilaration of discovery. I knew, with absolute certainty, what lay behind that wall. And I knew I had to get there before Alistair did. The race was on, and the finish line was just a wall away. The museum was largely quiet at this hour, a hushed mausoleum of forgotten histories. But for me, it hummed with an almost electric energy. Every shadow seemed to hold Alistair, every distant echo his footsteps. I printed the combined map overlays, the architectural blueprints, and then, with a calculated risk, I darted back to Alistair's office. The door was unlocked. He wouldn't expect me to be so bold. My heart hammered, a drum solo in my chest, as I quickly scrolled through my phone's camera roll. Yes, the clandestine photos I'd snapped earlier, in a moment of visceral shock and instinct, were still there. The damning evidence of his years-long conspiracy, his detailed research into Isabella Crowe, and his half-deciphered code. It was a professional death sentence for him, but the only way to resurrect Isabella's legacy, and by extension, my own integrity. I quickly compiled a digital folder ready to present. I headed straight for Miss Eleanor Vance's office. The museum director was known for her formidable intellect and her equally formidable skepticism. Her door was ajar, a sliver of light illuminating the late-night silence. She was still at her desk, a solitary figure poring over budget reports. "Miss Vance?" My voice was a shaky whisper, but the urgency behind it was undeniable. She looked up, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, her expression one of weary surprise. "Maria, what on earth are you doing here at this hour? I thought you'd packed up for the night." I've solved it," I blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "Isabella Crowe's painting, it's not just a painting, it's a map, and I know where her lost masterpiece is. I also know that Dr. Finch has been actively sabotaging my work to claim it for himself." Miss Vance's eyebrows rose, a clear sign of her disbelief. "Maria, I appreciate your passion, but this sounds rather dramatic. And Dr. Finch, he's a respected scholar. Are you feeling all right?" There was a hint of concern in her tone, but mostly the dismissive impatience I'd grown accustomed to. "I have proof, Miss Vance, undeniable proof." I laid the printed maps on her desk, carefully aligning the overlays. "This is the X-ray scan of dusk over the Thames," I began, pointing. "The constellations are wrong for the 1880s sky. That's because they aren't stars, they're London landmarks disguised. Isabella Crowe used the heavens as a key to map her city, her life. This," I said, pointing to the superimposed street map, "shows the locations. Her studio, her patron's home, the Royal Academy, and finally, here." My finger landed precisely on the outline of the museum's Victorian wing. I then pulled out the old blueprints. And here, Miss Vance, this architectural void, an unlabeled, walled-off alcove tucked between two galleries, it's the destination. Miss Vance leaned closer, her initial skepticism slowly giving way to a flicker of intrigue. "A narrative style in English that interacts with the dramatic events of the story. Then back to my overlay. An architectural void. I recall something about that in the archives, a space deemed structurally unsound during a post-war renovation and simply sealed off. But to suggest a painting is hidden there." "It's more than a suggestion," I pressed, my voice gaining strength. "It's a deliberate, complex cipher. Isabella Crowe was brilliant. She didn't want her masterpiece to be simply lost. She wanted it found by someone who truly saw her work, someone who understood its depth." Then came the hardest part. "And Dr. Finch," I continued, pulling up the photos on my tablet, "he knew. He's known for years. He's been researching Isabella Crowe, deciphering parts of this code, and he used me to complete it. He sent me on wild goose chases like the London Astrolabe Society while he waited for me to hand him the final piece. I showed her the photos of Alistair's notes, pages filled with Isabella's name, cross-referenced historical addresses, calculations that mirrored my own, and even a partially solved star chart that aligned with my early findings. The dates on his notes stretched back a decade. The evidence was damning, irrefutable. It wasn't just my word against his, it was his own meticulous, incriminating research. Miss Vance's face, usually composed, tightened into a mask of shock and anger. Her eyes, magnified by her glasses, scanned the tablet screen, lingering on Alistair's familiar handwriting, his precise annotations. The silence in the room stretched, heavy with the weight of betrayal. This is a grave accusation, Maria," she said, her voice low, almost a growl. "But the evidence you've presented, if this is true, Dr. Finch has committed a professional felony, and Isabella Crowe's legacy has been suppressed for over a century." She stood up, her gaze now fixed on the blueprints. The architectural void suddenly seemed to pulse with untold history. "We need to verify this immediately," she declared, her resolve firm. "Call the head of facilities, tell them to assemble a discreet crew. Tonight, I want that wall opened before morning, Maria, and I want Dr. Finch's office sealed and his access revoked, effective immediately." Her eyes met mine, a flicker of admiration now replacing the earlier doubt. "You've done something extraordinary, Maria. You've uncovered not just a painting, but a truth that has been buried for too long." My heart soared. The race wasn't just against Alistair anymore. It was for Isabella. And Miss Vance, once a barrier, was now an unexpected, powerful ally. The finish line was no longer a theoretical wall, but a physical one, waiting to be breached. The head of facilities, Mr. Harrison, arrived with his crew within 20 minutes, looking bleary-eyed but efficiently professional. Miss Vance, her posture rigid with purpose, explained the situation with an economy of words that left no room for question. The discreet team, accustomed to late-night restoration emergencies, quickly assessed the location. It was indeed a section of wall in the museum's oldest wing, near the rarely visited East Asian collection, perfectly matching the architectural void on the blueprints. The air vibrated with a nervous energy that was almost palpable. "We'll need to be careful," Mr. Harrison murmured, running a gloved hand over the plaster. "Don't want to damage anything on the other side, especially if it's as you suspect, Miss Morales." I nodded, my breath held tight in my chest. This wasn't just about a painting anymore. It was about rectifying a historical injustice, about giving a voice back to a woman silenced by time and circumstance. The crew set up their equipment, a hushed whirring of drills, the careful tap of hammers. Dust motes danced in the beams of their headlamps as they began to meticulously chip away at the plaster and brick. Every scrape, every muffled thud felt like a beat of my own heart. Miss Vance stood beside me, her arms crossed, her expression a fascinating blend of anticipation and stern authority. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a section of the wall gave way, revealing not another wall, but a dark, enclosed space. The air that rushed out was stale, ancient, carrying the scent of old paper and canvas. Mr. Harrison shone his powerful beam into the void. And there it was. My gasp was involuntary, a choked sound of pure awe. In the center of the dusty chamber, resting on a specially constructed, albeit crude, wooden easel, stood a canvas. It was large, commanding, covered with a thin, almost translucent sheet of protective cloth. Even through the veil, I could see the vibrant, almost impossible colors shimmering in the dim light. It glowed. "Oh my God," Miss Vance breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Her usual stoicism had crumbled, replaced by an expression of profound wonder. Carefully, reverently, one of the crew members reached in and gently pulled back the protective sheet. And then Isabella Crowe's, the luminary, was revealed in its full, breathtaking glory. It wasn't a landscape nor a portrait. It was an abstract explosion of light and color, a swirling vortex of deep blues, fiery oranges, and blinding whites, unlike anything I had ever seen from the 19th century. It defied every convention, every expectation. It was revolutionary, a century ahead of its time, pulsating with an inner energy that made my skin tingle. It was a testament to a genius that had been deliberately suppressed, a defiant scream against obscurity. Tears welled in my eyes as I realized the full weight of what we had found. Isabella Crowe hadn't just painted a picture, she had painted a vision of the future. A future she knew she wouldn't live to see acknowledged, but one she fiercely believed would eventually arrive. The hours that followed were a blur of intense activity. Conservators were called in, their faces alight with professional excitement as they carefully secured the luminary for transport to a climate-controlled vault. Simultaneously, Miss Vance had made good on her promise. Alastair's office was indeed sealed, a discreet notice posted on the door citing internal investigation. His access cards were deactivated, his name quietly removed from the museum directory. The fall of a respected scholar was handled with the swift, silent efficiency typical of institutions guarding their reputations. He wouldn't be seeing the light of day, or the luminary. The next morning, sleep-deprived but utterly exhilarated, I received a summons to Miss Vance's office. She sat behind her desk, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Maria," she began, "you've not only solved a complex historical mystery, but you've also exposed a profound breach of academic ethics. Dr. Finch's actions are inexcusable. His research notes corroborated everything you presented. He will face the appropriate consequences." She paused, her gaze softening. "As for you, the board is immensely impressed. Your dedication, your meticulous work, your unwavering belief in Isabella Crowe, it's truly remarkable. We want to offer you the lead position for a new special exhibition, Isabella Crowe, A Legacy Restored. We believe you are uniquely positioned to tell her story." My heart swelled, a joyous, almost painful ache. It was more than I could have ever dreamed. "Yes, Miss Vance," I managed, my voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely yes." Weeks later, the press conference was a whirlwind. The museum's grand hall buzzed with journalists and flashing cameras. The luminary, meticulously cleaned and displayed in a specially designed exhibit, dominated the stage. Its vibrant color seemed to drink in the spotlight, radiating a profound energy. I stood at the podium, a little nervous, but mostly filled with a quiet sense of triumph. I didn't talk about myself, about the long nights or the betrayal. I talked about Isabella Crowe. "Today," I began, my voice clear and steady, "we are not just unveiling a painting, we are restoring a voice. Isabella Crowe was a visionary, an artist whose genius transcended the limitations of her era. The luminary is more than a masterpiece. It is a testament to her courage, her intellect, and her unwavering belief in the power of art to communicate across centuries." I spoke of her subtle rebellion, her intricate cipher hidden in plain sight, a challenge to anyone who truly cared to look beyond the surface. I spoke of her fierce desire for her true work to be seen, not by the fickle critics of her time, but by those who would appreciate its timeless message. As I finished, a wave of applause erupted, genuine and resounding. I looked out at the faces in the crowd, seeing not just journalists, but art lovers, students, curious individuals. And in their eyes, reflecting the vibrant light from the luminary, I saw understanding, I saw recognition. Alastair's name was barely a footnote in the official museum statement, his professional disgrace handled with discretion. His ambition had been his undoing, his betrayal the final, ironic key to unlocking Isabella's secret. But it was Isabella's light that truly shone now, vibrant and unextinguished. And standing there, bathed in the glow of her resurrected legacy, I felt my own voice, once a whisper, finally begin to resonate. I hadn't just found a painting, I had helped a brilliant woman's truth echo through time, and in doing so, I had found my own profound reward. My journey as an art restorer had just begun, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would never again be overlooked. The canvas of my own life, like Isabella's, was just beginning to reveal its true, brilliant colors.